Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I am your host, Jim Jones. So glad you joined us today. We are starting a new chapter in the Daodejing. We are going to begin chapter 11. So let me start by sharing my screen. Let's jump into this here. The framework that we've looked at here before, I want to kind of just revisit for a minute because we're going to start engaging in this chapter with, in particular, this kind of passage from absence to presence and back again. And I just want to remind you that the word for absence in the Chinese character for that is wu, and the Chinese character for presence is yu. And that what we're saying here is not that there's two different things. It's all still this idea that it's one thing, but it's in different states of manifestation, we might say. So absence would be this idea of more without form, and presence would be the idea with form, but it's kind of the same underlying substance, let's say. And so that there isn't actually a nothing, that even what appears to be absence or appears to be empty is actually, in a sense, kind of pregnant with possibility, that it has the ability to in a sense, kind of give it. We'll use kind of like the terminology of giving birth, right? That there's this idea that things kind of come into being, and then there's this idea of them coming back out of being, and that's this return to source. So this is kind of a core part of this overall framework of how they're looking at reality that's going to play into how we look at this chapter. Now, the other thing I'm going to do that's a little bit different with this chapter is I picked a completely different translation to go through this one, because I think of all the ones that I have, this is the one that I think really did the best job of clearly showing the different kinds of contrasts that are being brought up in the text. So let's go ahead and start looking at this. It starts off and it says, the 30 spokes share one hub to make a wheel, though its non-being, through its non-being, there is the use of the carriage. Now, I'm kind of throwing some Chinese characters in here along the way, so I hope that didn't make it too confusing in reading it, but I want you to be able to see where they're coming into play. So the concept here is we've got a wheel, but there's this hub in the middle that's empty, right? That doesn't seem to be anything, but that's actually what makes it have the ability to do what a wheel needs to do. And so the empty part they're talking about here is translated as non-being, but this is that word you, that character, right? The same one that we're translating in other places as absence or without or not, right? And then it says there is, which is the character for you. And this is the idea of presence. So we see these things being contrast, but it's making a point that there's these things that are manifest. So we think about the 10,000 things, and they come together in such a configuration. But what ultimately makes them able to do something is the fact that there's an aspect of it that doesn't exist or that is empty. And so it's through that wu aspect of it that it takes on this ability to have a use or a function. And in this case, it's for the carriage. So there's this very interesting connection dynamic between the absence and presence, between the wu and the you, in terms of where that use actually comes from. So we'll look at the next example they bring up. So mold clay into a vessel. Through its non-being, there is the use of the vessel. So again, we have this idea that there is the thing, right? The vessel that's created, the you part of stuff, the presence side of stuff. But it's the fact that it is empty inside that actually gives it any type of actual function or use. Now, another thing that's kind of interesting about this, if we were to think about this from, let's say, an artisan perspective, there's kind of an ironic aspect of this as well. in that we could spend time making a very beautiful vessel that we would be, proud to show off or to show. But it becomes kind of ironic in the sense that the only reason it's actually able to do something is the part that you didn't have anything to do with, the empty part, right? It's like, that makes it kind of interesting in terms of how we think about, as we've talked about several times within Taoism, this idea of taking credit. If the value of the thing is actually the empty space, you can't create empty, right? It's we're taking credit for the outer part, which is part of it for sure, and it's something that's of benefit. But there's this other aspect of it that's vital for it to even have any kind of use that we don't have any ability to actually create. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic between these things. And I think it feeds into this idea of being careful about taking credit for things. But we can see here the exact same parallels being made between Wu, this idea of non-being or absence, and Yu, this idea of being or presence. And then where Yong comes into play in terms of usefulness, being the combination of how these things work together. Then this is the final example they give. They say, cut out doors and windows to make a house. Through its non-being, there is the use of the house. So again, same kind of dynamics here. The Wu, the empty spots, either in the house or the windows or the doors that allow things to come and go, is what actually gives the usefulness to the thing, the you, the house, that is. So they require kind of both aspects of this to function. So it says then, and we usually get a therefore when it's coming to our, making sense of this whole thing. Therefore, in the being, and this is combining two different characters here. We have Yu and Ji. And this is like kind of like how we would use the word of. So it's almost kind of like, therefore, in the of being, or we could say becoming, in the sense of becoming being, becoming something out of nothing, the absence to presence. So in that movement, in that process to being, there lies benefit. And this is another key term that's going to come up as a contrast here at the end. So there's a benefit to this idea of coming into beingness. And then it says, in the non-being, and again, here we have Wu Ji. So it's kind of like this process of becoming non-being. So we've got this kind of ongoing movement from being back to non-being, or from presence back to absence. So in the non-being of a thing, there lies its use. And again, we're using the translation here from Ellen Chen today because it brings out these contrasts better, I think, in the text than some of the other translations we had. So here we're kind of getting some very interesting things that are brought out in terms of how we think about this ongoing transition from absence to presence, and then from presence back to absence, or from Wu to Yu, and from Yu back to Wu. So let's look at how we might want to talk about this a little bit. We think here, just a reminder about this transition that we're looking at. It's over here in this whole process of movement from absence to presence and back from presence to absence. Again, it's the same thing. It's just different manifestations of that thing that we perceive. And the part that we perceive, the part that we interact with, the part that it makes up our world, is this idea of presence, or what they talk about, the 10,000 things. But these 10,000 things actually all derive from this idea of absence, and ultimately go back to the state of absence, or of non-form, or no thing. So there's this ongoing movement between the two. So in the first phase, where we're going from Wu to You, from absence to presence. It's saying that this is a benefit. And the concept here of Li is benefit in the sense of it's not in contrast to harm. It's not like a financial transaction. It's more kind of like saying good, but whereas good might take on more kind of a value judgment, I guess you could kind of say the same thing of benefit. It's just another way of kind of trying to show that this is actually a positive thing, because this is where the 10,000 things come from. And in fact, we make up part of that 10,000 things. So the fact that there is this movement, this process from Wu to You is what makes everything that we experience and everything that we're a part of, in a sense, part of our reality, that we can participate in this whole thing at all is only because we are part of that 10,000 things. So that's a key component here, that this is not a negative thing, but this is a positive thing, that this is happening. So then we have this idea of Yong, which is this idea of use or purpose. So frequently when we're considering more of these kind of like big questions, like what am I here for? Why am I part of this 10,000 things? What is the point of something existing versus not existing? What is the point of all this happening? We'll get back to asking questions about purpose, meaning, so forth. And so part of what this is bringing out is that in this movement from Wu to You, from absence to presence, there is this interchange between presence and absence, or between being and non-being, whereby usefulness or purpose exists. So in each of these examples they gave, what makes those things valuable or have use or have purpose is because of this kind of combination between the structure. So if we think about the vase, it's got the thingness of it, but it's also the absence of it that actually makes it have this value or this usefulness. But then the idea is that this use, or the existence of thingness, is actually impermanent. It's not a static thing. It's not a constant thing. Things wear out, they break down. And ultimately, when they break down, then they are essentially kind of going back to this nothingness, right? Back to the absence, back to formlessness. And so we can think about this whole cycle that's happening with everything, whether we're talking about mountains. And of course, in that case, we're talking about on a much longer time scale as far as humans are concerned. But if we think about the existence of the universe, it's actually a brief moment in time, even for something like that. So everything, again, if we think about that time, is it a long time? Is it a short time? Well, these are all relative kind of questions. And for this kind of a worldview, the bigger question is not like how much time do we have? And it's not that we want to preserve that time. And we'll see here in a moment that there's a reason why we want to get to that point of impermanence, because it keeps that cycle going. But it's our doing what we are able to do because we are a thing, because we are part of presence, because we are part of this larger aspect of presence, this 10,000 things. And there's this balance with Wu, there's this ability to do things, and in doing those things we kind of, in a sense, use up the idea of presence. And so that's then going to bring us to the last part here, where we have that transition from You back to Wu. And here we've got this idea that the fullness of being, or the attainment of what it means to have that purpose or that function as a thing within that realm of presence, is only fully actually attained at the end, when it's finished. So we can think about like that wheel. It's that combination of presence, it's that combination of absence that gives it its usefulness, but that usefulness is going to actually wear it out. it's going to eventually break that wheel down to the point where it's no longer able to function as a wheel. And ultimately, the constituent parts are going to either be used as something different or possibly burned up. And eventually we see it kind of returning back to non-being. And then that cycle kind of continues. So there's into presence, out of presence. And the same thing is going to happen with that vase. Same thing is going to happen with that house. And the same thing is going to happen with us and with everything, right? There's this continuous process of everything that we experience in our reality of going in and out of this idea of absence and presence, or formlessness and formfulness, whatever we want to say there, right? It's this movement back and forth between the two. But what I find intriguing here is that they're saying that the ultimate fullness of what does it mean then to have had this time as a being is actually attained at the time that it wears out. So if we think about humans and we're thinking about this idea of purpose or meaning, part of where we get that is where it ends. And we've kind of talked a little bit on here before about the ironic aspect of the fact that we are mortal, that it is the briefness of our life, the fact that it's ephemeral, it's not forever, that actually allows it to have significance and meaning, because it comes to an end. And we don't know when. There's a time, but because it's not forever, there's actually a value, an urgency, a specialness to it that would not exist if it was forever. If it was forever, it's very difficult to make meaning out of anything, because there's no differentiation. Everything just kind of blurs. If we have something that we want to do or try and accomplish, maybe I'll get that next millennium. It's like there's no urgency. It just kind of drags out. So the idea of immortality in that sense is just as much of a problem, if not more of a problem, than the idea of mortality, because it's impossible to kind of derive at any kind of meaning or value. But because life is short, that creates that meaning and that purpose. And so what we're seeing here is the same kind of an idea, that fullness then is being attained when we get to the end of that. And that end is different for everything. There's not like this expectation that there's a certain period of time that something has to exist in order for it to be, let's say, of value. It's everything has its own unique, let's say, value and fullness that's going to be attained and fully understood only at the point when it ceases to exist. And I see that somebody had a chat, but I can't read it. So maybe somebody can tell me what's...
Yeah, Martin said he'll do the dishes next millennium.
Yeah, exactly. So I find this concept extremely fascinating in terms of, kind of bringing it back to the farmer with the horses, the horse that escapes, and how the question of, is this a good thing or a bad thing, kind of keeps flip-flopping back and forth through the life events in terms of how the rest of the community is interpreting what's happening. But for the farmer, he keeps saying, well, we'll see. And in that perspective of taking that larger time, there is definitely a changing of how it's being interpreted as a good thing or a bad thing, which makes it very hard to say if anything is actually good or bad, right? But then there's the idea is we don't know when it ends. Now, it's not going to end when the farmer ends, but for the farmer, it'll end at the time that he ends. And then you can, in a sense, kind of know the fullness of that story. What was his story? And I think at that point is where this idea of that fullness of being is attained in that transition from you back to Wu. And I'm just going to kind of pause here and open this up then for us to kind of talk about what that might look like or mean as we're kind of contemplating different aspects of our lives or our own mortality. So welcome
Nothing.
to a deep topic for Friday morning.
I was gonna say nothing
Yeah,
easier
that
than
was
to
my
discuss your
first thought.
mortality.
Nice and early
Yes. Just in time for the
to
weekend.
come to terms with our short lives.
Where are the millennia when you need them?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm personally having a really hard time kind of wrapping my head around the whole thing. I have picked up a lot of the small things, especially that horse and the broken leg story that has really stuck with me. And like other like individual sessions, certain aspects, certain thoughts kind of either reinforced my thinking, reinforced my um, outlook on the world, or maybe challenged it here and there. But as a whole concept, as a whole teaching, I'm just having a really hard time with it, comprehending on one hand, as well as.
I think you're moving away from your microphone.
Sorry, no, I'm just speaking lower and lower.
Just fading out.
Yeah, exactly. Fading out as I contemplate my mortality. No, yeah, it's I'm personally just having a little bit of a harder time with the overall teaching, and there's the whole package, I should say. I have had great success and a lot of good times with the individual bits and pieces, but as the whole package is just oof.
Yeah. So there's probably a couple of different things we're dealing with here. One of them is going to be how well does this match up with the worldview that we actually hold? Because of course we're getting confronted with a worldview that's maybe different or alien to what we're used to. And then there's also the question of, are we comprehending the ideas, whether or not we actually agree with them or adopt them? So, Martin, when you're talking about struggling with the bigger picture, is it struggling in the sense of incorporating it into your life, or in terms of understanding the concepts?
It's understanding the concepts. I think as I pick up the individual pieces, I can take those and incorporate them, compare them to what I'm thinking already, and either boost up my theological position there, or challenge my own position to think about things differently. But it's that overall package, understanding and the concepts, how do they intermingle, and how, like, it's like a brand new religion for me, and I've never been in any religion whatsoever, right? So this is like 1 hour a week for however many months we've done that. It's just a little bit too little for me to put together, I guess.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And one of the things I would still suggest is that religion is an interesting term. So, in one sense, a religion is a philosophy in terms of, how do we answer those bigger questions about meaning and purpose in life? But I would make a distinction between, at least at this classical level with Taoism, and religion, in the sense that I think it's more presented on the philosophical side than the religious side. And for me, the main distinction I see between religion and philosophy is the introduction of more of a supernatural element, whether that's, in terms of like spirits or deities or demons or something like that. Whereas the way I understand it is that this, especially in the classical stage, that Taoism is really kind of contained within more of a natural framework. It doesn't venture into the supernatural.
100% agree with that, Virgin. And I maybe even add here that maybe it's just my ESL, as a second language. This whole new framework forces me to think just a little bit differently.
Yeah. No, for all of us, I think I know myself, one of the reasons I enjoy teaching is it forces me to have to dive deeper into a topic, because I don't know what kind of questions are going to come up. And I end up learning a lot more because of, subjecting myself to having to present it. And it's definitely been a long learning process for me as well. It's not a quick thing to just kind of get your head around. But maybe what we can do is, if there's like an aspect of it that you found particularly baffling, we can explore that further. Is there pieces of this or particular concepts that stand out as needing some attention?
Yes.
Any particular area or just the whole thing?
Yeah, I think that the whole thing is just, it is, yeah, the individual pieces, the bits and pieces, I'm always able to grasp, maybe not remember, but grasp and process within that one day that we have it. But it's just the intermingling in the bigger concept altogether.
Yeah, well, let me try and do kind of maybe a recap of that, and I'll try and keep it as non-encumbered as possible, and might make it easier to kind of see how the big pieces fit together.
Jim, I also don't want
I
to take all the space. I want
Oh.
Taylor and Jess and Dwayne to be able to have their own as well. Sorry, just to put you on the spot, but
Yeah,
because
That's
I do
okay.
take a lot of space everywhere. But
I was just gonna say, I agree. I'm very new to philosophy, and sometimes like I don't have my own thoughts on it because I haven't had time to really let it brew. But when other people are in here that have, they've spent more time on philosophy, like Ron or David or Josiah, and hearing the conversation between them and you, Jim, sometimes makes it click, just because they have questions to ask because they've done a lot of philosophy stuff before. That's usually pretty helpful. But yeah, if we don't have that, sometimes I'm like, okay, I'm hearing what Jim's telling me and I get what he's saying, but I don't necessarily have like my own thoughts about it yet because I don't have enough understanding of it.
well, let me see if I can try and make it a little bit more tangible here at some of the core concepts. So, really fundamental and baked into the whole term Tao itself is this recognition that there are patterns that exist in the world, that there's a way things unfold, that if we pay attention, we can see some kind of regularity to it, that there's a pattern that can be discerned. And the fact that there is patterns is vital to the existence of life itself. Because if there wasn't a consistency in the way that things unfolded, there would, I mean, literally everything that we experience, how atoms connect, is always going to function in a similar way in terms of how they're dealing with the overabundance or lackingness of electrons that allow them to come together to form molecules which become larger structures up to the point of who we are, right? If that pattern wasn't always there, nothing would exist. That there are certain forces that seem to exist, like gravity, that if gravity didn't exist, there'd be a lot of problems. Nothing in the universe would form the way it did, because even stars ultimately are brought together through this force of gravity that makes them do what they do. So the Taoists are concerned with, how can we recognize what these patterns are? And we do this all the time. Every culture does this. We figure out patterns of what foods are good for us and what foods will kill us, or I guess poison's not food, but what things we can eat and what things we can't eat, right? We figure out, different techniques for how we're doing hunting or how we're building houses, or ultimately how we learned how to do agriculture and all the different things we do. It's always these patterns. How can we understand what they are so that we can use them, so we can work with them? That when we go against those patterns that are kind of baked into reality, then we end up kind of knocking our head against the wall. We're not going to be successful because we are not engaging properly with the way things are, the way they work. So to get there, we need to make sure we don't have things blinding our vision, right? These other kinds of values and ways of trying to see the world in terms of what we want to be or what we think should be, as opposed to what actually is. So fundamentally, That's like the goal, is how do we see clearly the nature of reality so we can recognize how things work, these patterns, and how can we adjust our lives so that we're working in harmony with that instead of against it. So that would be like the bottom line fundamental piece, which doesn't prescribe anything in particular in terms of telling you what is. It's more of a methodology for trying to get at how do we understand what is. So it's kind of like science is a process. It's like a way of trying to understand, learn things, discover things, but it doesn't tell you what those things are. It's a way for you to find them. So that would be like step number one. And then from that, there are some observations that they have made that make sense of how the rest of the pieces kind of fit together. There are this pattern that things seem to come into existence, right? So there's this generative aspect of creation or of the world where, life just kind of seems to happen, that animals and humans and other things kind of give birth, and there's this reproduction, but there's also this coming to an end. Plants decompose, humans die and decompose, and everything ultimately does. Even the most hardest substance are eventually worn away by things like wind and water, which they found just intriguing. How can this soft, supple thing like water actually wear through stone? So in recognizing this is where they're coming with this idea that there's something that's actually making all this stuff up, and there's a process by which it's coming into like this idea of form and going back out to not having form. And so they and this would be maybe more of the speculative side of things, they would say there's actually just, everything is actually just this one thing. It's just kind of configured in different ways. Now, for us in our current time frame, we can see a very similar way of thinking from our latest understandings of the nature of things, is that we can say a very similar concept. Everything is one thing. Everything that's in my office, including myself, including everything in your office and yourselves, we're all made up of atoms, right? The desk, the computer, my body. So in that level, we could say everything is one thing in the sense that everything is atoms, but we can even break it down further than that, and that atoms are made of particles. And there's just a handful of particles that seem to make up everything that we experience, plus a couple of forces. And then there's this idea that's more on the speculative side, but it seems as though there's this idea that there's quantum field in which there's these agitations that are what actually make the particles. So we're right back at the same idea that there's one thing that's configured in different ways that makes up everything that we experience, including what seems like empty space or vacuum is still a thing. It's still quantized within quantum mechanics. So there's a lot of parallel where we can understand this idea of oneness in terms of everything is just one thing. Once we kind of get our head around that, so there's patterns, and those patterns are happening within a context that we're fully embedded within. We're not outside of it looking in. All views are from the inside. And in that inside, everything is essentially, we're seeing one thing that's just manifest in different ways. So pause there for a second, because this is kind of that fundamental kind of worldview that's happening from the Taoist perspective. Are you tracking with this so far?
So, yes, and it just makes me wonder, what does it change about what does this understanding of this change about my life? Because
yeah, and that's actually the very next thing, right? Is okay.
Sorry about that.
No, this is good. That means that you're tracking with the right path. Where I was heading with this whole thing is the next question is if everything is in fact one thing, and there are these patterns that we can discern in the way that the universe functions, then the next question is, well, what are the implications of that for me? And how should I be doing things? So one of the implications that I think is quite fundamental is if everything is one thing and nothing can exist without everything else that is existing, then the kind of default mode, at least if we're thinking about 21st century Western American thinking, or I don't want to say American because we're Canada and America here in this call, but in the Western view, we tend to think of things as very separate, as very individualized, as distinct in themselves. But if, it's like, can a person be separate? Like, if I can't exist without air, without something to stand on, without food, without, gravity and all these other elements, can I really be separate? Coffee, yes. Can I exist without coffee? So if that's the case, then I have to have much more of a concern about everything else that I'm actually connected with, because my existence is actually dependent on all these other things. So I can't be thinking about my world just from what benefits me as an individual. I have to think about what benefits the world that I live in, because without the world that I live in, I don't exist. And this is, I think, one of the big shifts that's happening in Western thought right now, is the realization that we kind of got ourselves into a bit of a pickle, because we've been thinking about things as individual things that could be used and just resources for, specific benefit, without recognizing how everything was actually interconnected. And by messing with the system, we're getting things out of balance, and the system may actually go through a massive transformation because of our ignorance of the interconnectedness of everything. So, now we're having to stop and recalibrate and figure out how can we, work at mitigating the consequences of this past behavior, and what can we do going forward. These would be very intentional changes that are happening in terms of our ethics, in terms of our just perceptions of how we want to interact in the world, that come through a recognition of this interconnectedness. And we could even take it a step further to say, the oneness of everything. So that would be one area that comes into play. Go ahead.
So this is, and not to mean it, not to mean it in any bad way, but this is very high level, very, what is that word that doesn't mean specific?
Abstract.
It's very, yeah, and what exactly are we talking about? Are we talking about climate change? Are we talking about social interactions? Are we talking about the global wars? Are we talking about more climate change? And what exactly you're referring to that you, I guess at least in your interpretation, I would say, because I recognize that it may be different for others, that has gotten us into a pickle. We need to think about doing those things differently.
Right. So I would say, I tend to speak in generalities because I want to understand the mechanisms or the process by which we evaluate different things, rather than getting stuck on a specific thing. But I also want to be able to take it into the specifics. So climate change would definitely be one of those specifics, right? And it's definitely one of those things where we can see, and let's just even be extremely generous with this and say that we know that the planet goes through different climate cycles. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, that we're not certain that human activity is causing some of the different changes that we're seeing in climate change. Let's just for the sake of argument, even if we're not concerned about that particular piece, we can see all sorts of other impacts in terms of pollution. right? So right now, there's all kinds of plastic chemicals that exist in everything that never used to be there. That's in all the water, that's in all of our bodies. And we're still not quite sure what the implications of that are. We can see the implications of how we've been working with different herbicides and how that gets into the food system, not just, people, but everything else in the environment. And questions about how those have impacts on things. We can look at, air quality and how we've had to make different standards to help mitigate, where we had air quality that was so bad, people were just getting sick from breathing, right? Same thing with water and farming practices, and what are they doing in terms of, how we're treating other living creatures and so forth. So there's a lot of things we can look at where our mindset has been. We live in a world of separate things that can be used as resources for whatever our particular desires are, and essentially without consequence. And now we're recognizing that that's not actually the world that we live in, that there's a connection between all these things, and there are consequences for how we use things. And we're going to have to figure out how to reevaluate that. Now, this wasn't an easy one mindset. This is something that had to work through a lot of what science was able to uncover in terms of, recognizing again these patterns. And this is where I see such an interesting correlation between Taoism and what was happening with, kind of more in our modern day sense of looking at the world, because it gets back to this idea of how do we recognize these patterns of what's happening, and then once we see those patterns, how do we put those into action? How do we think about them in terms of our lives? The other one that for me is super substantial is the fact that this oneness, this interconnectedness, and there's lots of ways we can look at this interconnectedness, has implications in terms of how we think about human behavior. And as the particular form of naturalist that I am, that happens to think that free will is not a thing, that is a natural carry through of this idea of these patterns existing and everything being a matter of cause and effect, from, all the way at the quantum level, all the way up to our perspective. And I know some people would challenge about the quantum level, and they would say, well, what about, quantum indeterminacy and all these kinds of things? There's definitely different interpretations of that, and we don't have a solid solution on it. But to me, it seems like there is more of a continuity there than not. And there's certainly some different interpretations of quantum mechanics that are fully accepted within the academy. Of course, there's battling ideas, but for the sake of this argument, that everything unfolds according to these patterns. And because of that, how I find myself right here at this moment is a consequence of the chain of events behind me going all the way back to the Big Bang, that nothing could have essentially been different in that whole journey and still end up at this particular point in time, which means that so much of what constitutes my ways of being in the world is utterly out of my control, completely. I mean, we can see even some basic stuff like, none of us chose our parents. We didn't get to choose the time and place that we were born, what kind of education we received as children, or what kind of nourishment we received, what kind of life experiences did we grow up in a wartime or peacetime, all these things impacting how it makes us into who we are. And I would argue that that goes through every aspect of who we are, that there isn't really anything that is what we would call free will. I would argue that the flip side of that is that what we really want is to make sure that we're learning machines, that our future behaviors are influenced by things that we've learned in the past. And that I very much affirm, and does not actually require free will for that to be the case. But if that's the case, which would be a consequence of everything being one thing and the fact that there's these patterns, then that shifts in a tremendous way the way I'm able to have compassion, both for myself and other people in terms of how their actions happen. Does not change the idea that we're still trying to shape social constructs in different ways in terms of what kinds of behaviors we can incorporate and which ones we can't. And the fact that individuals might not be able to fit within a certain way of doing things because they just can't behave differently. But where that changes in terms of what the interpretation of that becomes much more a question about more of a compassionate response. It gets more into how do we think about in terms of restoration, or what's going on with the system that is generating this type of behavior, as opposed to thinking of the individual as an individual, that they just did a wrong thing. They're choosing to do this. Therefore, I'm justified in punishing, exacting revenge. That whole process completely changes. So it doesn't do away with this idea that we have responsibility. It's just changing how we see that responsibility as more penultimate versus ultimate responsibility. And in my mind, not only does that allow for a greater level of compassion in terms of people who behave in ways that are different than my way of thinking about things, but it also keeps me more open to looking at the bigger system in terms of how, if we want to make progress in a certain direction, that we can't simply blame it on some individual, because that blinds us to the fact that there's other factors involved, right? So if we're just looking at individual things and thinking about in terms of individual responsibility, we're going to miss the bigger picture that's going to be necessary to understand those patterns for how we move forward in more productive ways. So I know I'm speaking in more abstract and general terms, but I would say for me, the two biggest impacts at a personal level are recognizing my interconnectedness to everything, and also my ability to have compassion for myself when I fail to live up to my own expectations, as well as other people when they fail to live up to my expectations, and gives me better tools for thinking about how do we move forward, because of the implications of this fundamental way of looking at the world.
That was beautiful. I really want to commend you for having that very concise and very succinct way of summarizing all that and describing it, because this is really, really good. I have one question for you to dive deeper into. What exactly do you perceive as the free will? What it is and what it is not? Because I think that you and I have a very different understanding of the free will.
Sure. And I realize this is a big topic, so I'll try to do some justice.
Like we go to Jess.
Yeah. Basically, the idea is, if we were able to wind the clock backwards on something, like just before you asked this question about free will, could you have chosen to do something different? Could you have chosen not to ask the question? And what I would say is that the cascading of everything that was going on, including what you were hearing from me that was impacting the way information is being processed in your brain, is all leading up to you asking that question. And that if everything in the universe was exactly the same, if you wound the clock back and you played it forward, it could not have unfolded in a different way. Now, your question was in response to what you were hearing from me. You didn't come back and say, Jim, what do you think of the term prestidigitation? Right? I mean, you would be like, what are you talking about? Where did that come from? Why is that an issue? It is going to be based off of what you have experienced and learned up to that point, which is driving the type of behavior, including this question, that makes sense because it's a part of what was going on. If free will is saying you could have chosen to do otherwise, then it's saying it's not necessarily based on past states, right? That it could be independent of that. And if it was independent of past states, it would be more of what we think of as random. And random would be you asking me a question about prestidigitation out of nowhere. And it's like, that's not what we want. That would be like crazy, right? What we want is to have our actions informed by our past, our experiences and things that we've learned. And that's what actually happens if we are learning machines as opposed to actually having some kind of free will. From a technical perspective, the challenge is you have to explain how somehow humans can violate what the entire universe adheres to in terms of everything being cause and effect based off of, laws of physics as we understand them. Of course, we don't understand all of them perfectly, and we don't understand the nature of everything in the universe. But what we do see is that there's that consistency, and that consistency actually has to exist in order for life to exist. Those patterns have to be consistent. The only way science works is that there are patterns that we can observe that work every time. That's how we're having this communication over Zoom right now. So we would have to answer the question of how are humans bypassing this universal process if it was going to be different.
And let me, as I've learned as a learning machine not too long ago, let me play this back to you, see if I understand it correctly. Because from kind of my angle, what I'm hearing you say is that the decision of me making that decision of asking the question or not asking the question for the sake of simplicity is determined by my previous experiences. If my previous experiences were a little bit different, by the consequence of these decisions being made differently before, the decision to not ask the question would have been influenced by that. So it's not necessarily about we're still making decisions, but those are predetermined by the experiences that we had and values that we have built in the past. So if we were able to exactly describe the pattern of the nature that led me to have certain values and led me to care about the free will or not care about the free will, that's what determined me asking the question when you said we don't have a free will. And I wanted to challenge that because my personality was predisposed to that based on my previous experiences and the environment that I was introduced to at that moment resulted in certain behavior of mine, in certain decision making. So it's not necessarily that if I decide to do something, it's not, I'm deciding it based on, well, is it comfortable for me? Do I have time? Do I want to? Was my day good enough for me to do that? Do I have the energy to do that? And it's not necessarily of, well, I just decide because I decide because of everything else in the past. Is that right?
Yeah, we still go through the process of like deliberating, like you said, right? And we can contemplate things, but our ability to contemplate, our ability to deliberate, is based off of all these other factors. That how we ultimately end or derive at the conclusion is a debate about our conscious awareness of it. Did it happen already? And the conscious part of it is just kind of a justification to ourselves about how we got to that conclusion, as well as justification to other people, which many would argue for, that there's kind of a post hoc interpretation of what happened that we see as our conscious experience. It's very much going to feel like we are making decisions and deliberating, and in the same way that when I go outside, it is an unshakable illusion that it looks like the sun is rising in the morning, right? We know from other information that goes beyond my senses that are limited that it's actually the earth that's spinning that causes it to look like the sun is rising. And I'm not standing still on some kind of stable platform, but I'm spinning quickly and rotating around the sun as well. So there's illusions that we can't shake, even if we know differently. So I still feel like I'm making decisions all the time and deliberating. But I would argue that what's actually happening behind the scenes is there's all sorts of calculations going on in the brain that are getting me to a particular point based off of past information, current information, and, maybe there's some past goals that were established in terms of where I'm trying to get to that will dictate what those patterns are that unfold, in the same way that I don't have to think about getting my heart to beat. The brain just kind of handles that for me. It's probably handling all those things. Plus, there's this added layer of consciousness that is giving me kind of a running narrative of why I'm doing those things. That is probably happening after I actually do them, after I actually decide them, rather than before. But again, we'll have to spend some more time on that one to get into more of the scientific studies that would explain why that's the case.
So I think to kind of sum this conversation up from my perspective is the concept of a free will in the generic day-to-day. It's like, yeah, sure, you decide, you make your decision as you want to, but fundamentally in the back end, as you said, in the detail, if there was an observer that understood exactly where my patterns were, what my current state is, and what all of my experiences were, they would be able to predict how am I going to decide because of all the other patterns that I have been through in the past and how they have influenced me, how my machine learning has learned from my own past and my own environments. So it's predetermined based on the actual experiences, not necessarily that I don't get to decide. It's just that it's. Thank you. I understand what you mean. It doesn't. I think for the bigger picture, it doesn't necessarily change my behavior because I'm still going to be doing, as you said, the elaboration. I'm still going to be considering. I'm still going to be thinking about are, if not predetermined per se, they are very influenced in the day-to-day perspective. When I explain this to my mother, they're influenced, not predetermined, by all of my experiences that led me to this point in time. And that's as you said, when you apply it to others, that when Jess decided to hire me was not her fault. It was predetermined for her by her experiences in the past. And same thing goes for all the negative things as well, right? Like, I mean, talk about, as you mentioned, when people are, for example, houseless, it is not like they decided to be houseless. It's that their experiences, their environment led them to decisions that ended up being not working out for them. And it's not their own fault. It's for me to look beyond that, their own decisions, and look at what led them to it, what systems I need to work in the future or try to change that lead people to those traps and to those places of misfortune. You want to call it that?
Yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of factors involved, right? And so the key thing is we still have the illusion of making those decisions, but if we recognize that there's more going on behind the scenes, that's where the compassion part comes into play. And recognizing the same thing I'm wrestling with is the same thing everybody else is wrestling with. And that is, we're a product of circumstances that extends far beyond even our lifetime. So we can't in any way, shape, or form be ultimately responsible for all of our actions, even though we can still be held accountable for those actions. We do that accountability from a position of greater compassion.
And that will take you think about corporal punishment.
Exactly.
I want to jump in really quickly just because some of the concept, I know I'm talking in this meeting, it's very funny, but the concepts that you were discussing about this whole, like, if something out there realizes that certain things will influence my thinking in a certain way, will I make decisions based on that? There's a show called Mrs. Davis. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It is a weird show, and I can't remember what streaming service it's on, but it explores that concept from a technology perspective and a religion perspective in a really weird way. And it's fascinating because there's this like AI that predetermines what it wants to happen, and so it influences the decisions of the main characters based on those choices that they know that person's going to make. It's really cool. Is it on Crave? Maybe Crave or maybe Prime, but it's good. It's weird though.
I like, sometimes I like weird. There's one that was Dirk
Gently.
Yeah, Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency or something like that. Yeah, that show definitely incorporates a lot of these ideas. And then also Devs is a really good miniseries that explores that concept. So yeah, it's again, we can't answer everything today, but the one last thing I would say is I would talk about determinism as opposed to predeterminism, because predetermined sounds like it's being directed by some kind of master puppet,
Puppet master
tweaking the strings, and determinism is just saying that everything's a consequence of what came before. So that would just be one distinction I would make. So, well, this is a very good discussion, and we definitely can revisit this because I know there's probably going to be a lot of questions about those issues. So
Jim, one more thing, just a quick note. I think this helps me realize why this is so difficult for me as a big thing. I have a problem with memory, so I don't remember very specific pieces like the individual lessons. I interact with them at the time, I process them, I either take something from them or not, and then I forget that I've taken this learning from them. But this whole concept of predeterminism, I was already there ahead of time. I was not necessarily, I didn't get there through the same path, but I got there from, learning from the people. Why are you hostless? How did you get here? What got you there? And realizing the systems that were not working well. But I was already there. That's why I think I'm searching from these sessions for something new to believe in, and you're not giving me something new. You're like really confirming what I've already been in there. And that's maybe one of the reasons why I'm having such a hard time with this big concept, because it's like I'm expecting something new, and you're just saying you already are there. So that's maybe for me. Why?
No, that's good. And I think in some respects, kind of my experience is that there's a lot of familiarity that I was finding the deeper I dove into Taoism. It just walks through some interesting challenges in terms of what are the implications and how do you work it out in this, that, or the other situation. And that's what these individual chapters start to bring us through. So yeah, it's all good. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining today. And if you are watching this and would like to come on board, you can go to www.kinship.cafe and register, and you will get links to join us on our Zoom conversation. So have a good day, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.